In Hopeville, a small, isolated mountain community, there lived Miguel, a boy with deep, sorrowful eyes whose existence was marked by the silence of rejection. His light footsteps scarcely left a trace on the compacted earth as he wandered through the village's alleys like a shadow no one wished to notice. Since birth, he carried the burden of abandonment, found one cold winter morning at the doorstep of the only local church, swaddled in tattered rags and accompanied by a tear-stained note. The delicate features of his face and the marks of such a painful beginning set him apart from the other residents of the village, where appearance and family status determined each person's worth. Despite its hopeful name, the village concealed an obsessive devotion to social conventions in its narrow lanes and stone houses. Prominent families occupied the finest properties atop the hill, while the less fortunate struggled for dignity in the lower quarters. In this setting of silent divisions, Miguel belonged nowhere. Not even the local orphanage, run with strict severity by Mrs. Martins, truly embraced him. Among the other orphans, he was always the last to receive attention, the first to be forgotten, his needs never a priority. On cold nights, when the biting wind slipped through the gaps in the walls of the shared dormitory, Miguel would huddle under thin blankets and close his eyes tightly, trying to imagine the arms of a mother he had never known. In his restless dreams, he saw a face blurred by the mists of time, heard a voice singing softly, and felt a warmth that reality had never granted him. Upon waking, only the coldness of the morning awaited, along with the indifferent stares of those who were meant to care for him. At the community's makeshift school, Miguel always sat at the back, attempting to merge with the wall to escape the mockery and insults of his classmates. Nobody's child, abandoned bastard, born from a mistake. Words that cut deeper than any blade, wounding a heart that, despite everything, remained remarkably capable of love. While the teachers pretended not to notice the tears that sometimes welled up in his eyes, the boy developed an inner strength that even the village's elders found surprising. This strength did not come from anger or a desire for revenge, as one might expect. It came from somewhere mysterious, a deep connection to something greater than he could fully comprehend. In his loneliest hours, Miguel would make his way to the small chapel at the far end of the village, a place almost as forgotten as he was. There, sitting in the last worn wooden pew, he would speak to God as if confiding in a close friend. There were no formalities in his prayers, only the raw sincerity of a heart that, having found no love on earth, sought it in the heavens. "Lord," he would whisper as the setting sun cast colored shadows through the dusty stained glass windows, "I know I'm not like the others. I know no one wanted me. But do you want me? Does you have any plan for me? Or am I just a mistake that no one could fix?" The silence following these words seemed in some strange way comforting, almost as if the ancient walls of the chapel were embracing his doubts and turning them into a silent hope. It was on one of those solitary afternoons of prayer that Miguel met Mrs. Isabel. While most villagers treated the boy with disdain or, at best, indifference, the elderly woman with white hair and hands wrinkled by time had long observed him, recognizing in him something that others could not see. That very day, upon finding him kneeling before the simple altar, she approached slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane. "Purest faith," she said in a voice surprisingly firm for her age, "is the faith born from the deepest suffering." Miguel looked up, startled by the unexpected presence. His eyes, still glistening with unshed tears, met those of the elderly lady, eyes of a faded blue, yet incredibly lively and penetrating. "Are you talking to me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Isabel smiled, a smile that contained more human warmth than Miguel had ever known in his short life. "Yes, my child. With whom else would I be speaking in this empty chapel? I'm not used to it. People usually don't talk to me." The old lady sat beside him on the pew, her joints creaking softly in protest. "People rarely see what truly matters. They only see what their limited eyes allow. But I have been watching you for some time, Miguel, and I see much more than just a lonely boy." The boy's heart raced. "How do you know my name?" "I know everyone in this village. I've lived here far longer than I care to admit," she laughed gently. "But you are special. Special. The word sounded strange to ears accustomed solely to insults and commands. Miguel lowered his eyes, unable to process what it meant to be considered special by someone. "You're mistaken," he murmured. "There's nothing special about me. I'm just the child no one wanted." Mrs. Isabel extended her wrinkled hand and touched his chin, lifting his face gently so their eyes could meet again. "Sometimes," she said with a conviction that seemed to radiate ancient wisdom, "those whom the world rejects are exactly the ones God chooses to perform his greatest miracles." Something in her words pierced the barrier of pain Miguel had built around his heart. A small crack opened, letting in a ray of hope. Not the naive, fleeting hope of childhood, but something deeper and more enduring. A hope that would withstand the most severe storms yet to come. From that day on, an unlikely bond formed between the rejected boy and the venerable old woman. Mrs. Isabel had lost her husband and children during an epidemic that ravaged the region decades earlier, and she lived alone in a small stone house on the village's outskirts. Her own life had been marked by devastating losses, but rather than hardening her heart, the pain had opened channels of understanding and compassion that few could fathom. 3 times a week, Miguel would slip away from the orphanage after finishing his chores and run to Mrs. Isabel's home. There, seated at a weathered wooden table, they would share herbal tea brewed from the modest garden of the old lady and engage in conversations that nourished the starving soul of the boy. She told him ancient stories passed down through generations about men and women who, despite seemingly insurmountable hardships, had found their divine purpose. "Look at Joseph," she would say, her gnarled fingers leafing through an old, leather-bound book. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, unjustly imprisoned, forgotten for years in a foreign jail. And yet God used him to save not only his family, but entire nations from famine. Miguel listened with rapt attention, his eyes alight with a mix of wonder and recognition. In the tales Mrs. Isabel recounted, he began to glimpse possibilities for his own life that he had never dared to imagine. Or Moses, she continued on another day, abandoned in a river as a baby, raised in a foreign household, wandering for years in the desert. Who would have imagined he would become the liberator of his people? "But they were truly special," Miguel protested once. "I'm just me." Mrs. Isabel smiled patiently. "And who said that just you isn't enough in God's eyes? He is not looking for extraordinary talents, my child, but for hearts willing to serve him despite their scars." As the months passed, another figure entered Miguel's life. John, a young carpenter who had recently returned to the village after years away, noticed the lonely boy who often sat in the shade of an old oak tree watching him work. Unlike the other men in town, John did not seem bothered by Miguel's quiet presence. On the contrary, he began to chat with him casually as he finely shaped wood with his precise tools. John carried his own marks. A deep scar ran from his forehead to his chin, a remnant of an accident that nearly cost him his sight. This physical mark, coupled with his humble origins, had made him the target of prejudice similar to what Miguel faced. Perhaps for this reason, an unspoken understanding developed between them, requiring little more than a few words. "You know," John remarked one day as he meticulously sanded the wood of a chair he was building, "wood teaches us a great deal about life." Miguel watched, fascinated, the rhythmic movement of John's skilled hands. "How so?" "Look at this board," explained the carpenter, showing him a seemingly ordinary piece of wood. "It has these knots, these imperfections. Many carpenters would reject it and search for something perfect. But I see beauty in these marks. They tell the story of the tree, the winds that battered it, the seasons it endured." Running his calloused fingers over the uneven surface, John continued, "Instead of hiding these marks, I will highlight them in the final design. They will become the centerpiece of the piece's beauty." In that shared glance lay more understanding than many words could convey. Miguel realized that John was not merely discussing wood. He was speaking of himself, of the marks he carried, and of the possibility that his own pain might one day transform into something beautiful. The influence of Mrs. Isabel and John gradually began to change something fundamental in Miguel. Rejection and abandonment remained realities in his life, Other orphans still shunned him. Teachers continued to overlook him. Villagers still whispered as he passed by. Yet these things no longer completely defined who he was. A seed of a deeper identity began to sprout within him, nurtured by the words and affection of these two unlikely allies. Beneath his frail appearance and withdrawn temperament, Miguel was developing an extraordinary inner strength. When one of the older boys at the orphanage accidentally broke a valuable porcelain vase and, fearing punishment, blamed Miguel, the boy accepted the blame without protest. 3 days of confinement in a dark, damp storage room with inadequate food became the price for his silence. When Mrs. Martins discovered what had happened, she questioned why he did not defend himself. What good would that do? Miguel simply replied, "No one would believe me over his word. Besides, he's afraid I'm used to being punished." The growing empathy in the boy's heart often surprised even those who were starting to see him beyond the stigma. Morning, John found him feeding an old sick dog that everyone in town avoided. "This animal might be rabid," John warned, a note of concern in his voice. "It could be dangerous." Miguel gently stroked the creature's head, which, surprisingly, appeared completely docile under his touch. "It isn't rabid," he answered with an inexplicable certainty. "It's just in pain and afraid. I know what that feels like." Life in Hopeville seemed to proceed in its normal rhythm. Seasons changed, harvests came and went, children were born, and elderly people passed away. Miguel turned 12, then 13, then 14. His body began showing the first signs of the transformation from childhood to adolescence, although he remained smaller and leaner than others his. But the true transformation occurred on levels the ordinary eye could not perceive. It was during this period that his first dreams began. Not the common dreams of a child imagining impossible futures, but intense, vivid visions that awoke him in the early hours of the morning, heart pounding, forehead slick with cold sweat. In these visions, Miguel saw devastated fields, children crying from hunger, dry wells, and a darkness that seemed to swallow the entire village. The images were so real, so palpable, that he would often leave his bed in the dormitory and wander through the night, checking if the horror he witnessed in his dreams had already begun. "They're just nightmares," John assured him when Miguel hesitantly described the disturbing visions. "Just a result of everything you've been through." But Mrs. Isabel, upon hearing the detailed accounts of these dreams, visibly paled. Her trembling hands grasped the table between them. "They're not just dreams," she murmured finally. "They're warnings." The confused look on the boy's face spurred her to continue in a low, urgent voice. "There were others before. You, Miguel. People who dreamed of what was to come. My own grandmother had this gift, or was it a curse, depending on how you see it. She predicted the great flood that destroyed half the village 100 years ago. No one believed her until the waters came." A shiver ran down the boy's spine. "Are you saying that what I see in these dreams is really going to happen?" The elderly woman sighed deeply. "I cannot say for certain, but I know we must not ignore warnings wherever they come from." The following months brought growing unrest, both to Miguel and to Hopeville itself. Spring, which usually burst forth with vibrant colors and delightful fragrances across the surrounding fields, proved abnormally dry. The local farmers watched the sky with growing concern, noting the absence of the rains that were meant to nourish the freshly sown seeds. The elders scratched their heads trying to recall the last time the season had been so arid. However, true panic set in when the first signs of an unknown disease appeared in the crops. It began with small black spots on the leaves, quickly spreading and consuming the plants until they were reduced to dried, dark skeletons. The phenomenon spread alarmingly fast, moving from one field to another as if it had a life of its own. "It's a punishment," declared Reverend Thomas during a tense sermon at the church, now crowded with anxious townspeople. "A sign that we have strayed from divine ways." While the adults debated theories and sought explanations, Miguel watched the disaster unfolding exactly as he had seen in his dreams. The black spots on the fields, the premature yellowing of foliage, the growing despair in the eyes of the farmers. Everything was following the macabre script that had played in his nightly visions. Soon, food shortages began to severely affect the community. The reserves stored from previous years quickly dwindled. Entire families started to starve. The once vibrant local market turned into a battleground over the few available goods. Prices soared, making food inaccessible to the poorest. The orphanage, which depended on the charity of the townspeople and its own small vegetable garden, was among the first to suffer the full impact of the crisis. Meals, already meager and near. Normal times became even scarcer. Miguel watched with increasing anguish as the younger children cried from hunger at night, their pale faces and empty eyes reminding him of his own childhood. One particularly difficult night, as the wind howled, outside the poorly sealed windows of the dormitory, Miguel awoke once again from one of his prophetic dreams. This time, however, something was different. In addition to images of desolation, there was light, faint at first, then growing steadily stronger, and a voice that seemed to speak directly to his soul. "Rise," the voice said softly yet unmistakably. "It was no accident that you were spared. It was no accident that your heart remained intact despite all you have suffered." Miguel sat up in bed, heart racing, unsure whether he was still asleep or fully awake. The darkness around him seemed different, almost tangible, as if it were a living presence. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. No audible answer came, but within him, a crystal-clear certainty formed. It was time to act. It was time to use everything he had learned from pain, from rejection, and also from the unexpected love that Mrs. Isabel and John had shown him. The next morning, with a determination that surprised even himself, Miguel sought out Mrs. Martins, the rigid administrator of the orphanage. "I need to speak with the village council," he declared, his usually timid voice now firm and resolute. The stern woman laughed dismissively. "The council? And why would moi? They listen to an insignificant orphan like you." "Because I know how we can survive this plague," he replied simply. "I know what needs to be done." Something in the boy's conviction made the woman pause. After a moment of consideration, she shrugged. "Do as you please. I doubt they'd even allow you into the council's meeting room." But to everyone's surprise, including Miguel's own, their request for him to address the council was granted. Later, he would learn that John had interceded on his behalf, persuading some influential members to spare a few minutes of their time, more out of curiosity than any real hope that he could offer a solution. On an overcast afternoon, Miguel stood before the 8 men and 2 women who comprised the Hopeville Council. Seated around a large oak table in the town hall's main chamber, the councilors regarded him with expressions ranging from barely concealed skepticism to outright hostility. "Well then," began Councilor Augustus, a burly man with a graying beard who presided over the group, "we understand you have a solution for our crisis. We are listening." Miguel took a deep breath. For a brief moment, the old insecurity threatened to overtake him. Who was he to be there? An orphan with no name, no family, no formal education, standing before the community's leaders. The echo of Mrs. Martins's voice rang in his mind. An insignificant orphan. But then he remembered Mrs. Isabel's words, John's confident gaze, and above all the voice in his dream. He lifted his head and began to speak, his voice growing stronger with every word. "This plague destroying our crops is not a punishment," he said. "It is a test not of our faith but of our ability to act as a true community. We have been too proud, too divided, the rich atop the hill and the poor below. Some have so much, while others have so little." Murmurs of unease rippled through the room, yet Miguel pressed on, driven by a courage he had never known he possessed. "In my dreams I saw what is to come. The worst is still ahead, but I also saw the solution." He paused, looking directly into the eyes of each counselor. "We must pool what we have, not just food, but our knowledge, our skills, our labor. The families on the hill have spacious barns, unused tools, and even streams on their property that have not yet dried up. The families down below have willing hands, ancient knowledge of drought-resistant plants, and techniques to extract water from seemingly barren places." Counselor Helena, a middle-aged woman whose eyes shone with sharp intelligence, leaned forward. Are you suggesting we share our possessions? That we open our private properties? I am suggesting, Miguel replied serenely, that we remember we are one village, that the suffering of one is the suffering of all, that the hunger that kills a child in the lower quarters will eventually reach the mansions atop the hill. A heavy silence followed, laden with possibility. Some counselors exchanged intrigued looks, while others maintained impassive expressions. Beautiful words, Counselor Augustus finally said, but words do not fill empty stomachs. What do you propose exactly? Then Miguel detailed his plan. A plan born both from his mysterious dreams and the old community practices Mrs. Isabel had told him about, from a time before pride and social divisions took hold. He spoke of establishing communal kitchens, where the little food available could yield much more if prepared together. He explained how small water reservoirs might be built to capture the morning dew and the rare rain. He described alternative planting methods that John had taught him during his years away from the village. But above all, Miguel spoke about the need for unity, to dismantle, even if temporarily, the invisible barriers that separated Hopeville's inhabitants. If we continue as we are, he concluded, divided and thinking only of our individual survival, we will all perish. But together, we still have a chance. When he finished, a thoughtful silence filled the chamber, not the uncomfortable silence of before, but one heavy with reflection. How can we be sure that your plan will work? Asked Counselor Helena, her voice now stripped of its earlier arrogance. Miguel looked out the window at the fields devastated by the plague. We cannot be sure, he admitted honestly, but we are certain of what will happen if we do nothing. The ensuing debate lasted for hours. Miguel was dismissed after his presentation, yet he remained outside the building, seated on the stone steps waiting. John joined him after some time, followed by Mrs. Isabel, who slowly made her way over with the assistance of her cane. You were magnificent in there, John said, giving Miguel's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. I only said what needed to be said, the boy replied, still surprised by his own boldness. Mrs. Isabel smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. Whatever decision they make, you have played your part. You have shown the way. Now it is up to them to decide whether to follow. As the sun began to set, the doors of the council chamber finally opened. Counselor Augustus appeared, his face tired, yet his eyes reflecting a renewed determination. Miguel, he called, the council would like to speak with you again. When the boy returned to the chamber, he found the counselors standing, a different energy permeating the room. We have decided, announced Augustus, to implement your plan. Not because we blindly believe in dreams and omens, but because we recognize the practical wisdom behind your suggestions. Counselor Helena stepped forward. We will need someone to coordinate these efforts, to serve as the bridge between the different parts of the village. Miguel nodded, wondering who else could shoulder such a responsibility. We would like that person to be you, she concluded. The shock was evident on the boy's face. Me? But I'm just an orphan? Counselor Augustus finished with a slight smile. Perhaps it is precisely because you belong to no influential family, hold no entrenched alliances or long-standing grudges, and, most importantly, have shown an understanding of our village as a whole that many of us in privileged positions have lost over the years. The days that followed were filled with intense activity in Hopeville. Under Miguel's unlikely guidance, and with growing support from the council, the community began to reorganize itself. The initial measures met resistance, particularly among the wealthier families. Opening their properties, sharing resources accumulated over generations, working side by side with those they had always regarded as inferior. All of it sparked tensions and resentments. Yet as hunger and despair grew worse, even the most reluctant started to see the wisdom in Miguel's plan. The communal kitchens set up at key points in the village allowed the scarce food to be distributed more equitably. Improvised irrigation systems, developed with the combined knowledge of the most experienced farmers, began to salvage some of the crops from total devastation. Slowly, something extraordinary began to occur. The rigid social barriers that had been maintained for generations started to crumble in the face of a common need. Wealthy women worked side by side with laundresses in the communal kitchens. Prosperous farmers learned ancient cultivation techniques from elderly peasants who had never set foot on their lands before. At the center of this transformation was Miguel, the boy no one wanted, now sought after by everyone. His ability to navigate between different social groups, truly listen to each person's concerns, and find creative solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems proved to be a gift as valuable as it was rare. "I never imagined I'd say this," Mrs. Martins remarked one afternoon, as she watched Miguel organize the distribution of soup in the orphanage's courtyard, now transformed into a community hub. "But it seems there is something special about that boy after all." Months passed, and although the situation remained critical, signs of recovery began to emerge. Some areas treated with collectively developed alternative methods showed the first indications of genuine regeneration. Extreme hunger had been contained, and not a single life was lost to starvation. A remarkable achievement given the crisis's severity. Yet more important was the transformation occurring in the hearts of Hopeville's residents. Pride gave way to humility, indifference to compassion, and individualism to collective responsibility. Former rivals became allies, age-old suspicions dissolved into unlikely friendships. On one particularly significant afternoon, the long-anticipated rain finally fell. Not a violent storm as everyone had feared, but a gentle, persistent shower that seeped deep into the parched soil. Men, women, and children emerged into the streets, lifting their faces toward the sky, feeling the drops as blessings upon their skin. Some wept with relief, while others laughed like children. Miguel stood motionless in the center of the main square, letting the rain wash away the silent tears streaming down his face. "It's a sign," murmured Mrs. Isabel at his side, her voice trembling with emotion. "A sign that we made the right choice." John, who had come to be like an older brother to Miguel during the months of crisis, squeezed the boy's shoulder firmly. "No," he corrected gently. "It's a sign that he made the right choice for all of us." The rain continued for, 3 days and 3 nights. When it finally ceased, the fields began showing the first genuine signs of recovery. The dark blotches that had ravaged the crops seemed less intense, and in some places, green sprouts emerged from the moist earth, symbols of a hope that only months ago had seemed impossible. Hopeville's life would never be the same again. The communal kitchens, originally established as an emergency measure, became permanent gathering places. The wealthier families who had reluctantly opened their properties during the crisis now organized harvest festivals in which everyone was welcome, regardless of social standing. The collective irrigation system, developed under the pressure of necessity, expanded and improved, benefiting the agricultural production of the entire region. More deeply, however, was the transformation within the hearts of the people. Old prejudices, so deeply rooted as to seem an intrinsic part of the village's fabric, began to crumble like ancient walls finally exposed to the elements. Rich and poor children played together in renewed public squares. Elders from both the affluent and humble parts of town shared traditional stories and remedies. Marriages between families once segregated by invisible social barriers ceased to be scandals, and instead became celebrations of new unity. At the center of this transformation, almost imperceptibly, Miguel found the place he had never had before. He was no longer the orphan, the bastard, the unwanted child. He was simply Miguel, the young man whose wisdom, born from suffering, had saved Hopeville not only from hunger, but from its own self-destructive rigidity. The orphanage itself underwent deep changes. Touched both by the crisis and by Miguel's example, Mrs. Martins began treating all the children with a kindness that shocked those who remembered her former severity. Donations increased significantly, enabling improvements to the facilities and the food supply. More importantly, local families started opening their homes for adoption at a rate never seen before, drastically reducing the number of children in institutional care. As for Miguel, at 16, he received an offer he had never imagined possible. "We want you to come live with us," John said one evening at the table of the small house he shared with his newly married wife, Martha. not as a guest or a helper, as our son. Martha, a young teacher whose generous heart perfectly matched John's, smiled through tears. We know we can never replace the parents you never had, nor do we want to try, but we can offer you a home, a family. Miguel's heart pounded. After all those years of dreaming about arms that would embrace him, of a place to call his own, reality seemed almost too wondrous to process. His voice failed him when he tried to respond, so he simply nodded, tears silently bearing witness to the depth of his emotion. The adoption ceremony was held in the very chapel where, years earlier, Miguel had first met Mrs. Isabel. The elderly lady, now frail but with eyes still bright with intelligence and affection, sat in the front row wearing her best dress for the occasion. Beside her, to everyone's surprise, was Mrs. Martins, who had insisted on attending the event. Reverend Thomas, whose attitude toward Miguel had changed dramatically since the days he preached of divine punishments, conducted a simple, yet deeply moving service. When the formal part was over, he invited the now unorphaned youth to say a few words. Miguel stood before the congregation, composed of nearly all the town's residents. He looked at the familiar faces, the very same ones that had once rejected him, and now regarded him with respect and, in many cases, genuine affection. He took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts that overflowed in his mind. My whole life, he began, I dreamed of a family, of parents who would love me, of a place where I belonged. His once hesitant voice grew stronger as he continued. Today that dream is coming true in a way I never imagined. Not only do John and Martha welcome me as their son, but I feel that all of Hopeville has somehow become my family. He paused, glancing at Mrs. Isabel, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I have learned from wise people that sometimes those whom the world rejects are exactly the ones chosen by God to perform His greatest miracles. For a long time I could not believe it. How could I, abandoned at birth and rejected at every step, be chosen for anything? His voice trembled slightly, but he went on. Now I understand that it is not despite my suffering, but through it, that I found my purpose. Every rejection, every lonely night, every insult endured, it all has prepared me to recognize the pain in others, to see beyond appearances, and to believe that hope always exists, even when everything seems lost. A murmur of approval ran through the chapel. Some discreetly wiped away tears. Miguel continued, his voice now imbued with a maturity far beyond his years. I do not know what the future holds for me or for our village, but I do know that together we can face any challenge. For we have learned the most important lesson. None of us is truly strong on our own. Our real strength lies in our community, in caring for one another, in being willing to see the value in each person, regardless of their origins or status. He looked directly into the eyes of John and Martha, who watched him with unmistakable pride. Thank you for giving me a home. And thank you all, he said, turning to the congregation, for teaching me that even the child that no one wanted can find his place in the world. When Miguel finished, a reverent silence filled the chapel. For several moments, soon replaced by spontaneous applause that expressed not only approval, but also a collective acknowledgement of the extraordinary journey they had shared. The celebration that followed in the central square was not just a celebration of Miguel's adoption, but of Hopeville's renewal. Long tables were set up end to end, laden with food grown in the revived fields. Music, dancing, and laughter filled the air as the sun sank on the horizon, casting golden shadows over the united community. In the years that followed, the story of Miguel and how he helped save Hopeville spread beyond the community's borders. Travelers passing through the region heard the tale and carried it with them, sowing inspiration elsewhere. Neighboring communities, facing their own challenges, sought the guidance of the young man whose wisdom seemed to transcend his age and experience. Miguel himself, now a young adult working alongside John in carpentry, while studying with tutors who recognized his sharp intellect, remained humble in the face of the attention he received. It wasn't I who saved the village, he insisted when asked. It was the village that saved itself by deciding that no one would be left behind. On a quiet afternoon, years after the events that had transformed Hopeville, Miguel visited the recently covered grave of Mrs. Isabel. The elderly woman had passed away peacefully in her sleep after a long, full life, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom and compassion that continued to touch all who had known her. "You were right," Miguel murmured, placing a bouquet of wildflowers upon the fresh earth. "Those whom the world rejects can indeed be chosen for the greatest miracles, not because they are inherently extraordinary, but because they understand the value of acceptance when it finally comes." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the surrounding trees, as if nature itself were answering his words. Miguel remained silent for a few moments, letting the memories of the scared boy in the chapel, the conversations at Mrs. Isabel's table, the prophetic dreams, the crisis that nearly destroyed the village and the transformation that followed, flow through him. When he finally rose to leave, Miguel cast one last glance at the grave. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing in me what even I could not see." As he walked back toward the now prosperous and united village, Miguel reflected on the mystery of divine paths, how the abandonment that had marked the beginning of his life had, in an inexplicable way, prepared the ground for the salvation of an entire community, how the pain he had borne for so long transformed into a sensitivity that allowed him to see beyond the visible, to feel the hidden suffering of others, and to believe in the possibility of healing, even when all seemed lost. The story of the boy that no one wanted, but whom God used to save his people, became an eternal reminder that divine designs often manifest through the most unlikely vessels, that human rejection does not determine a life's worth, and that the greatest miracles can emerge from the most invisible places. And on winter nights gathered around the hearths of Hopeville, this story was told and retold, passed down from generation to generation as a living testimony to the transformative power of faith, hope, and love that transcends all barriers. "Always remember," the elders would say to wide-eyed youngsters, "that no one is insignificant in God's eyes. Every life has a purpose, every suffering a meaning, and every heart an infinite capacity to love and be loved." For it was through the boy that no one wanted that we learned that even the most fragile vessel can contain the most precious essence, and that by embracing those whom society rejects, we may very well be welcoming those chosen to save us all.